Chapter 18 Bloodsworn LVL 9. Strength, 33. Vigor, 21. Durability, 21. Perception, 18. Processing, 15. Arak let the flow of power rob him of his mind for a moment as he waited for everyone to get ready for the sprint to come. Rutledge had swiftly deposited the energy core to Julius, telling the man that she had trouble enough walking without the hindrance. Nivea watched, leaning against the wall, only moving when they were ready to set out, and only with great effort. "I will fall behind. Do not slow down for me. Get my soldiers to safety." Nivea's words were half whisper and half hiss, pain robbing her of her composure. Arak nodded and she straightened, the weight removed as she waited as the last stragglers got to the edge of the rubble line. A whole block of houses had been leveled to nothing more than skeletons and strewn charred timbers jutting out to the sky. Then there was the gentle hill that the armory sprawled across. In the old days it had been plain hard-packed dirt with no signs of vegetation. Now it was fields of burnt ash where grass once lay, two roads running towards its gates, marred but still passable. They were going to run through the fields of ash and dust and hope to make it to one of the smaller gates before someone shot them. Arak didn't let his hopes get too high at the prospect as the nearly 50 civilians shuffled around nervously like sheep. It was a no-man's land of burnt-scoured earth. Arak had been watching off and on, and nothing had crossed that hill, guns on both sides firing and scorching the earth all around the circumference of the armory. The two guns they had silenced left them a thin corridor to run down. As long as the armory didn't fire on them. "Constance. You'll take the lead. Then the civilians and the professors. Then my squad, the Lord Bloodsworn, and I'll pull the rear guard." Nivea's each sentence sounded like she was forcing a boulder uphill. Her voice breathless as she rasped out her orders. Her bandages were spotted red and Arak watched as they spread out as she talked. Constance took one look at her pale officer and the bloody bandage before snapping off a crisp salute. She obeyed her orders, forcing the last of her men into position before they took off. Not in a fast all-out sprint, but in a steady jog that the civilians could keep up with. Rutledge was spry for her old age, holding her cane in one hand as she stayed tucked back at the edge of the crowd. Julius was already red-faced and sweating as he carried the orb up the hill. Then it was Nivea's personal squad, spread out along the edge of the crowd. Arak stepped forward, 1 foot past the line of demarcation before he turned back to see Nivea swaying. Arak looked back at the edge of the crowd and the dying Nivea. She would slow him down, increase the risk of a stray bolt from a cannon obliterating him. She was a risk to fulfilling his oaths that went beyond combat. Arak held shield and spear in one hand and reached over, grabbing Nivea under her knees and lifting her up and over his shoulder. He spun and bounded, pushing off as hard as he could as he raced to catch up with the crowd. Nivea beat weakly at his shoulder, her fist thumping ineffectively on his armor. "You fool. I'm slowing you down. Leave me." Each sentence was punctuated by the sound of knuckles on steel. Arak just kept his legs pumping, hardly feeling the strain of carrying her as he got close to the end of the train of people. The soldiers glanced back and there was a palpable sense of relief as they saw Nivea slung over his shoulder. They turned back and began to chide their charges to move faster as they began to move up the hill. "Arak? Behind us." Arak turned back and saw what she was talking about. A swarm of hellspawn filled the horizon, twisted and pale bodies wheeling on the ashen winds as they began to circle above them. Arak turned his head back around and began to stride faster. He caught up and ran in stride with the soldiers, and they began to look panicked as they glanced back. Their urging began to be filled with fear as they pushed the civilians harder. "Move it, you fat sacks of shit. Move it." Podkey screamed at them as he turned to look over his shoulder. His features became frozen with fear and he tripped and stumbled, catching himself with one hand and started to sprint up the hill. The circling hellspawn began to dive, their dark talons outstretched as they screamed in joy of the hunt. Arak wasn't a fan of being hunted. He tried to shift his hand, to get the spear at the ready so he could fight, but the straps on his shield were in the way and he couldn't adjust while holding Nivea to his shoulder. They strained up the center of the hill, the scarred wall of the armory rising to blot the horizon. Gun emplacements were burnt shells, craters where they had once stood. Soldiers scurried through the walls, visible as they ran by the holes in the outer walls. Men and women in Imperial uniform took up position, casters aimed at the sky and the swarm behind them. Arak could feel the hot breath of the demons on his back, and Navia cried out, either in pain or fear he knew not. Then a wall of fire was flashing overhead, the grounds lightening as the golden red fire illuminating the world. The sizzle of flesh burning filled his ears, and the screams of the hunt devolved into screams of agony as bodies began to fall. Corpse after corpse hit the ground with bone-shattering force, but more and more of the monsters came. Arak risked a glance back and saw that they had forced their way through the barrage, and the distance was not measured in inches rather than feet. Navia's sword slashed weakly and parted a talon from hand. She went limp against him, her entire being exerted in the effort. She still clung to her sword with a maniacal grip, refusing to yield it even as she perched on death's doorstep. Fire. The command boomed out and the world turned red. Arak's vision drowned, lost by the intensity of the blast of fire that covered the world. He staggered, blinking tears from his eyes as the rest of the party screamed and cowered, falling to the ground. Even Navia's soldiers staggered and fell, losing their grips on their discipline for a moment. Quickly. To the gates. Hands grasped and pulled at him, gentle and guiding as fellows spoke in Imperial, trying their hardest to guide the survivors onward. Arak kept blinking, trying to free his eyes of the burn and the glare of red superimposed over them. He looked up, vision still inundated red, and saw blurry doors swinging shut, and the clamor of the armory swelled up and rolled over him like a wave. Chapter 19. Close those doors. Captain Lee, get your men into the walls. More orders and more chaos as hands pried Navia away from him and led him to the side. By the cold god's frosted nuts, look at the size of him. Arak grimaced at the epithet. The cold one was something not evoked lightly, but these thin-blooded southerners knew little enough to take its name so lightly. Shut the fuck up, Horvath. Captain Nellis is on her way. Sir, just wait here. A hand pushed against him, urging him to back up. Arak gripped his spears tighter, but didn't switch to his free hand. There were numerous nervous soldiers around, and he didn't feel like testing his armor against an army. Lord Bloodsworn is mute. I am his translator, when I can see, that is, Julius declared. He was breathing hard but sounded alive enough. Arak just waited as his dim eyesight sharpened as his eyes recovered from whatever it was that the soldiers had used to clear the skies. Lord. A woman's voice, sharp and intelligent, asked. Arak stabbed his spear down, heard the crack of stone and someone's curse. Squinting tightly, he managed to get his shield off and started to pull the gauntlets free. I am Arak, Bloodsworn to the newest queen and on an official mission of the throne, Julius translated as Arak fished the ring free to show to the blurry shape of an imperial officer. Another ring bearer. We are up to 6 now. I had only met one in my whole life and now have 6 here. Strange times. Let's get you to the prince and general. They are most distraught with your maneuver. Arak made out a middle-aged woman with dark skin and darker eyes. Her shaven head had traces of silver, and she had a pair of large soldiers behind her. Arak gathered his gear and followed her, taking in the armory and everything inside of it. With every moment his vision got better and he saw the horrors of the war inside of the armory. Civilians sat in clustered huddles, thousands clinging to the shadows of the outer buildings, trying to stay out of the chaos of the soldiery. Different uniforms were everywhere, patches and insignias not matching as officers herded the defenders from one spot to the next. Dead lay in stacked piles like cordwood. Wounded lay in a morass of misery, moaning or crying, or just deathly still, as they waited. Frenetic medics ran between the cots or blankets they had been laid out on, and Arak watched as white light enshrouded their hands. Flesh knit back together in moments, and the cries stopped as a fully healed soldier got to his feet. There were so few healers in row after row of wounded. They spilled out of the infirmary and across the lawn of the building. Everywhere he looked Arak saw misery. Tens of thousands were moving about the massive fortress, in the walls and across courtyards, dozens of buildings hidden by the high walls. Then there were the floating docks in the center of the armory. It had originally been a keep that had been expanded into a massive working elevator that shuttled goods up to the sprawling docks that were over 200 feet above their heads. If the sky hadn't been shrouded in smoke, then they would have walked in the dockyard shadows. Now they simply marched in murk. He wasn't the only giant-blooded warrior here. 7-foot-tall behemoths of muscle walked about, strapped down with gear and weapons, acting as porters as they ran supplies across the vast distances. The tram lines that had once allowed for the rapid resupply of the walls vacated, the shining metal rails stepped over without looking. General Foy has taken command. Most of the general staff were killed in the opening minutes of the portal's opening. They were outside the walls and by the parade grounds. They never made it back. Captain Nellis broke the silence. Arak didn't. Then we had Prince Samus stroll through the doors like nothing was wrong. An official air. They have taken over a joint leadership role. Nellis's voice was contemptuous of the prince. Arak remembered reading about the prince in a dossier before coming here, but there was little about him. He was deemed a non-threat. Here. Nellis pointed to a squat building, no more than a hut, with a single guard outside of it. She passed by with barely a glance from the guard, and threw open the wooden door. Arak followed while wondering what surprises were waiting for him. Julius stayed stuck to his side, and when Arak looked back he was surprised to see Ridelge had attached herself to their small procession with no one mentioning her. She was a sneaky woman when she wished to be. The shack was just a covering to a metal stairwell that led down, Nellis's boots already clanging away as she trooped down. Arak followed more slowly, keeping his head on a swivel and alert to the sights. There was little to see, just steel walls and the soft blue light of whatever it was that had replaced the illumination strips. Similar to what was in the dungeon, Rutledge muttered behind him. "Professor, do you still want this orb?" "Of course, my dear boy, keep carrying it, will you? I am not as strong and young as I once was." "Of course, Professor." Julius sounded disheartened but didn't try to fight back against Rutledge. The stairs led them down, deep into the heart of the hill. 4 times the stair twisted back, each of them 10 steps downward. 40 feet under the earth, or close enough for Arak, when they passed by the first doorway. It was an open hatchway that led to a long tunnel lit with more of the pale blue lights. Soldiers were camped out here, playing about or playing dice and cards, their weapons close at hand. A dorm. They passed 2 more and had to be 60 feet deep when Nellis turned down a hall and got off the stairwell. There were no markings anywhere, and Arak wondered how long it took for everyone to remember what went where in a uniform environment. This wasn't a long dorm like the other stops had been, but rather a round room with maps spaced out everywhere. In the middle of the room was a holographic display that showed off the state of the armory. Arak paid close attention to the display and noticed that it was changed too. "General, we have visitors," the display said. Arak looked down at it for a moment before turning his attention to General Flay. An old woman with white hair cut brutally short to her wrinkled scalp. Piercing gunmetal gray eyes and a spine so rigid and straight Arak thought one could use it as a ruler. She hardly glanced their way, turning her head back before snapping back up again. To look at Rutledge. "Helena, I didn't know you were alive." Foy had a soft voice, but a firm hand as she pumped Rutledge's vigorously. "Nita, it is good to see you. It's been years. I had thought you had retired." Next month actually was the official retirement date. I was only a few weeks away from being on my estates in the Middle Kingdom. Alas, the world. This is Professor Julius Meckert of the Archaeology Department. And Arak, the Bloodsworn to our new queen. And ring-bearer. "Another one?" Incredulity filled her melodious voice, coming from the young man who had been standing in the corner. Whipcord lean and dressed in fashionable golds and blues, a ceremonial long saber rode on his hip. Red hair tucked back and into a warrior's knot showed the angled tips of his ears, hinting at his ancestry. Cream-colored skin and emerald eyes. His lips quirked up in amusement as he strode forward to introduce himself, hand-leading. "I am the 17th Prince, Samus Greenbat." Chapter 20. Arak didn't shake his hand, instead signed to him. The prince stopped instantly, folding his slim fingers behind his back as he watched Arok's fingers with rapt attention. "I am Arok, sworn shield of Queen Victoria. I have been entrusted with her will and sigil and granted all powers so forth," and with that, Arok pulled the little ring out and showed it to the prince. The prince didn't touch it, but looked at it closely, murmuring under his breath before straightening up to look at General Flay. "He is who he says he is. A true ring-bearer. Unlike the others. Fools have tried to imitate a ring-bearer?" Julius whispered, half in shock and half in scandal. 2 senators, a governor, a duke, and 1 rather scared postman. The postman we put to work while the others were given the rather honorable task of closing a breach on the walls. They didn't survive, unfortunately, the prince said without a trace of remorse. "Oh, it's a good thing Arok is a true iron ring then." "Indeed," Floy broke in. "And how is it that we can serve the imperial throne today?" Samus asked, irony rich in his voice. "I will take command of the warship above us and use her guns to clear the portal above the Iron Tower and then fly to the Imperial Palace." Arok explained himself eloquently and succinctly. Both the general and prince watched his fingers with no need of Julius's services. "That is all?" Floy asked, raising a single thin eyebrow. "My dear man, I fear there are several impediments to that plan," Samus said. Staff was trickling in, taking up positions around the edge of the room, and Floy turned to look at a handout given to her. "A third of our reserves were used in clearing that swarm off of you," Floy spat with venom in her faded voice. "Which I am quite glad for, Nita," Rutledge said with a sly smile. "This changes things, General," the holographic display said again. It was a smooth and genderless voice, neither deep nor high. Arok looked down at the display as he tugged his helm off, reveling in the feel of the cooler air on his skin. He ignored the horrified looks of everyone staring at him. "What is that?" Rutledge asked, leaning over to look at the display. Floy sighed and shook her head before waving at Samus. "That is the former artificial intelligence of the base. It was a basic AI that kept track of supplies, troops, logistics basically. Nothing too advanced." "Was?" Julius asked. "Was. Now, it's something different. Come on out, Dull." "Dull?" "Rutledge this time. They named themselves. I believe it's a reflection on how they previously viewed themselves," Samus said. "You were always a good student. Unlike your sister." Rutledge gave the boy the faintest of acknowledgments and he lit up, smile widening as he preened. "The prince is correct. I took the name for how I viewed myself," the voice said as a wispy shape came into being. Strands of light flickered about, forming strands until a blueprint of the armory came into being. Except it was twisting and turning, pieces moving at speeds that Arok couldn't keep track of. Basic knowledge spirit. Uncommon. Did all the AI become like this? Julius said as he pointed a knobby finger at the blueprint spinning in the air in front of them. "We obviously don't know, but that could be a good guess." Samus shrugged. Arok looked up towards where the Sword of Empire sat, ducked tight. She had an AI inside of her too, one far older and more renowned. "Ah, Arok also has seen what we have too. Yes, we believe the warship has a sentient spirit inside of it. One that has the potential to be much more dangerous. And Dull is quite dangerous inside the boundaries of his domain. Aren't you, Dull?" "I could kill everyone inside of this room in under 3 seconds, Dull informed them. Julius paled and gripped the energy orb tighter. "As long as there's functioning infrastructure that was once supported by them, they have access to it. So the vents deep down here, rail lines, everything. They are in complete control. Why aren't they working then?" Arok sighed. If this spirit was hostile, he'd have to figure out a way of neutralizing it. Power. I lack enough of it. The stores inside of the armory were supplemented by the city's power grid. When the change happened, my internal stores were converted into essence-powered machines or power sources. It's not enough currently to fully utilize the services of the building as well as man the defenses. "The third you burned through?" Arok asked. "It was supplementary firepower. The external stores were changed into a disposable, single-use munition, We were planning on holding that in reserve for their big push, Samus explained. The prince is correct. If my stores weren't being so heavily drained, I would have the ability to store and generate these munitions, but as it is, I can hardly keep the weapons online. The more damage is accrued, the weaker I grow. More of myself is broken up and scattered. Outer walls have 3 potential breach points already, Dull said. You were going to wait for them to breach and then just evaporate them with all the single-use munitions? Arak asked. That was the plan. We lure them into a single breach zone, pull all their local forces in with a slow fighting retreat, and then punch them in the nuts, Foy spat. And we can't access the Sword of Empire because of this, why? Arak asked. Samus chuckled and nodded toward Dull. The dockyards have a separate power supply, they are not connected to me at all. They also didn't have an AI for me to communicate with. Right now, Sword and I are trying to figure a way to power the doors to give us entrance, Dull said. Sword being the warship? Arak clarified. The spirit could read the silent tongue without pause. That is correct. There are several areas where we believe a power source could be added that would allow the doors and security systems to be operated. I believe I have the capabilities to produce these orbs. Eventually. Rutledge and Arak both turned to look at the power orb sitting nestled in Julius's hands. How many of these orbs do you need? Arak asked, taking and hosting the power orb up to Dull. The spirit grew silent and strands of light flickered over Arak's hand in the orb. If they are of the same quality as that one, at least 8. 4 to enter the dockyards from the keep, 2 to get through the security station in the dockyards, and 2 to open the outer seals into the ship. Do you know where you can get more of those? Samus asked. There was an edge of hope there. Arak handed back the orb to Julius and rolled his shoulders before talking to the rest of the group. They are coming to us, Arak signed. Not in the good way, are they? Samus said, shoulders slumping. 14-foot-tall monstrosities made of human flesh and muscle, powered by 6 of these at a time, Rutledge said. Which of the breaches is closest to falling? Arak asked. He was in a hurry and had no plan on waiting out a siege. After all, they still had 2/3 of the single-use weaponry left. Chapter 21. This is where we allow them to breach. Prince Samus had a cluster of officers around him. His lean form made a fitting image of royal heroism, his black uniform trim and his boots gleaming while his lacquer sword case glinted in what hazy light pierced the veil of ash above them. The cluster of officers around him nodded and took notes. A wall of junior officers were waiting behind them ready to actually carry out their orders. The section of wall they were looking at was near the middle of the wall, wide ceremonial gates half-slagged drooping on their hinges. Now useless tanks and armored vehicles had been dragged in front of the gates, forming a wall of hardened steel between the armory and the demons laying siege to them. Companies of soldiers were forming defensive lines, cracking open the stone roads with picks and hammers and digging firing lanes. A secondary elevated position was being made, sandbags and loose pieces of armor hastily erected over a latticework 12 feet in the air. Tarps were stretched across every building's roof, stretching it out to cover from peering eyes. Arak hadn't seen any of the hellspawn since the armory had blanketed the sky with fire. Cannons were being moved around from damaged parts of the wall and positioned to face the melted gate. Mortars and extra weapons were being dredged from the bowels of the armory, their handlers uncomfortable with their new designs. Arak kept grip of the simple steel of his spear and shield. There were no worries about sharpened steel and how it would be changed. If they keep their cycle pattern on firing, they'll be hitting this area in the next hour. We have to be ready when that happens. We lure them into the kill box and absolutely destroy them. But we have a secondary objective. They have large, flesh things. Samus looked around for help and Arak gave him a thumbs up. They're large and they have these inside of them. Samus lifted the parkour up with a quick flourish. Each of these monsters will have several inside of them, hosted in the joints and core. We will need to retrieve them after the battle to access the Sword of Empire. Any questions? There were lots of questions, and General Foy allowed the young prince to handle all of them. She stood off to the side, talking and pointing to her staff as they enacted her will. Samus was doing the morale portion of the briefing, giving general strategy and trying his best to encourage the men. Foy was doing all the hard work. They were playing off each other's strengths. Foy's whispery voice and frail frame was not something that the men could rally behind. Arak just waited for the two of them to tell him where to stand and who to kill. He grabbed a peanut and cracked the shell between his fingers, discarding the empty shell to the ground as he popped it in his mouth and enjoyed the snack. A pile of empty shells sat at his feet, growing larger by the moment. "I see that you are fine. I must thank you for carrying me," Nevia said, striding up to him, the picture of health. She had a new uniform on, the effects of her wounds nowhere to be seen. Arak offered her a peanut from his dwindling bag. She peered at it, tiny between his dirty, blood-caked hands, and then shrugged. She grabbed the peanut and carefully peeled it apart. "My men will stay with you. Wherever you go, so shall we." Arak was touched by that. Most of her soldiers had died, broken in the basement surrounded by the undead. If she had no desire to ever see him again, then he would not blame her. "We need better armor and a way to communicate with you aside from the academic." "I don't mind Julius, but he had no place in this." Arak agreed with her, but he could offer her nothing more than a thumbs up. "Excuse me, but I believe I have a solution to your problem," Dull said, materializing in wisps of white light in front of them. Nevia startled, her sword half drawn before she realized that Arak hadn't reacted. "There is a small research vessel in the floating docks. Not yet finished, unfortunately, but there was an AI stationed inside of it. Now, it hasn't communicated with me, but it should have been on a closed system, so there is a chance that it is alive. Once you enter the floating docks, if you would liberate my sibling, I would be grateful, and they may be able to help you with communications," Dull continued, ignoring the half-drawn sword. "The fuck is that?" Nevia demanded. "I am Dull, the spirit of the armory. I missed too much in the infirmary. Lord Bloodsworn, I am going to be trying to secure armor for my men and weapons that are a bit better suited for the tasks ahead. You will be here?" Arak nodded to her and went back to eating his peanuts. Samus had finished off his orders and was drifting closer and closer to Arak until he was standing right next to him. "I would never have guessed I would be here today. A leader of warriors. I would never have guessed about the demon invasion, personally," Arak signed to him. "Of course, that is the surprise of all surprises. As bad as this all is, and it is a tragedy beyond scale, it probably saved my life. Court politics can become a bit lethal, and a new queen, well, it would shake up the status quo. Some of my older siblings might have wanted to have pruned the family tree a bit, to say the least." Samus reached over and stole one of Arak's peanuts, throwing the whole thing in his mouth. "It's rather quite tragic. The blood loss and death that happens. It's why my sister ran away so young. Became an adventurer. Plundering ancient tombs or some such nonsense. She's out there, somewhere," Samus pointed out at the city while Arak stared at his bag of peanuts and the audacity of the smaller prince to steal from him. Samus reached and grabbed another one, munching noisily on it. "She came back here with her company for the coronation. Party of the decade," she said. How right she was. He grabbed another peanut. Arak grabbed his bag and pulled it back to himself. "I worry about her, but if there is anyone who could withstand what is happening, it is her. Well, and you, I guess. Where did you find that armor, by the way?" Arak just ate his peanuts as he turned away from the chatty prince and towards the army working to build their trap. He'd be busy soon enough. More challenges, more strength claimed, and one step closer to returning to the queen and fulfilling his oaths. Samus kept talking, filling the air with a constant stream of chatter as Arak munched away placidly. The time for action would be soon enough, and maybe the peanut-stealing prince would find himself on the wrong side of a demon's spear. Chapter 22. Here it comes. Samus yelled as the air around the gates burned hot and bright. The thin metal gates bars began to glow, within moments turning white-hot. Chains snapped taut and the gates were pulled inward, yanking open a hole that they were hoping to lure the demonic horde into. Arak shuffled from foot to foot as hundreds of casters focused on the hole in the wall. There were several retrofitted vehicles ready to be shoved into the breach to plug the hole once their goal was accomplished. A scream, high and piercing, rang out far above, and Iraq glanced up and tried to peer through the tarps stretched out covering a quarter of the entire armory's inner workings. He still couldn't see through the tarps, so he looked back toward the gates and waited for the demons to take the bait. Next to him Nevia shifted, looking uncomfortable in the liberated riot armor they had found in some dusty corner room. It had changed, the bulky vests becoming tight, but flexible, heavy leathers. It looked similar to what the infernal soldiers wore. She had managed to find and distribute knives and officers' swords, the officers having no need of them anymore. Her small command now was one of the most well-equipped: swords, knives, casters, and body armor. She had managed to even find some helmets that covered the majority of their heads. It was more than he had expected her to find. That Foy hadn't already raided those stores was disappointing. He had thought she was more thorough. "It's like the mouth of hell," Nevia whispered, staring at the now open gateway. Flames spewed into the armory, licking over the first of the barricades in a burst of dark flame. Soldiers disappeared in a flash as the flipped-over heavy metal tables and various salvaged equipment provided no protection. It had supposed to look like it was something that had been slapped together, and the soldiers there a fast reaction force. The demons kept firing their siege cannons, more and more bolts of flame searing away at the entrance. The stone around the gate glowed, pulsing white and standing out in the general murk of the day. Above, the cry came and caster fire filled the sky as Hellspawn came diving for them. Iraq kept his eyes focused on the glowing tunnel in the murk. Thick, oily smoke was billowing into the armory, and men began to cough as the first of the attackers came running forth. Infernal Soldier LVL 11. Infernal Soldier LVL 13. Infernal Commander LVL 14. They came flooding forward, scores of them, but Iraq kept his eyes locked on the newest enemy he had seen. The commander was different than the horror shows that were the regular soldiers or Hellspawn. It was shorter and broad with pale pink skin with poisonous green lines tattooed across its bald head. It carried a whip, leather braid studded with cruel bits of metal, flesh still clinging to it. It sneered, showing off thousands of small nubby teeth. Caster fire illuminated the world, and the first wave of infernal soldiers disintegrated. Iraq watched as the commander died, whip turned to ash. Iraq's disappointment in losing a fight was swiftly disabused as the next wave came rushing in, never slowing as they ran against walls of fire. For an hour Iraq watched as infernal soldiers, none above level 13, died by the hundreds inside of the glowing gateway. Commanders would appear, but died just as easily as their subordinates. Above them, Hellspawn circled and died, their limp bodies falling to hit unyielding stone and crunching. Weapons fire was flashing out from all around the armory walls. The entire fortress was being pressed. The siege weapons never stopped their assault as they tried to open a second breach. Soon, Samus said as he sauntered up to them. He had followed Nevia's example and taken some of the reformed riot armor and had a helm of stainless steel that reflected each of the bolt of caster fire. "Sir?" Nevia asked. Her soldiers shuffled closer, trying to eavesdrop on them. "They'll send the heavies. Those golems you were talking about. They can't breach the walls yet, and they're losing too many of their base troops trying to open up a gap. They'll send the heavies to force it open. Iraq, are you ready?" Iraq nodded. It was what this entire plan had been enacted for after all. He grabbed his spear and shook his arms out. And then waited. And waited. And waited. "They have a higher tolerance for casualties than I thought they would." And what Foy thought too. Samus pursed his lips and watched as a pile of charred corpses grew higher and higher with no end in sight. If the tunnel didn't get cleared soon, then they wouldn't need to put their barricades into place. The dead would defend the gate. Another 10 minutes passed and the caster fire was slowing down. The essence generated by the soldiers not enough to keep up with a steady swarm of bodies. Slowly but surely, the soldiers got further and further into the armory, pushing deep into the established kill box. The ground rumbled, so softly at first that Iraq couldn't tell in the chaos. a steady tremble that tickled his feet, but slowly increased to an earth-rattling rumble. A wet, red hand reached inside of the gateway and pulled, ripping free the partially melted stone, and then it was squeezing into the tunnel. Steam hissed as the golem crouched walked, the stone evaporating the wet blood and cooking its raw flesh. It stood up straight, towering above the field. 14 feet tall and white as the gates had been, with 4 oversized arms that drug across the ground. All of, aside from what had been cooked in the tunnel, was red and clotting, blood dripping off of it to splatter on the hot stone floors. Caster fire hit it, small scorch marks appearing wherever they touched, but not harming it. It lifted its square head up, a half-dozen eyes swirling madly in sockets as they looked about. 6 different eyes. 6 different colors. That looks to be your cue, Arak. I'll wish you luck from back here, Samus said with a fake smile. Arak looked away from him and hoisted his shield into position and started toward it. War Golem flesh rare. Arak started to jog, his armor rattling as he smiled behind his helm. This thing could be the challenge he was waiting for, something to truly push him to his limit. 6 mismatched eyes turned to look at him as he stepped in front of the defensive lines. Caster fire was redirected, targeting the hall behind the golem. The golem lifted a single arm up and brought it crashing down. Arak twisted his hips and hit it with his shield, exerting the entirety of his strength to push the arm to the side. Stone shattered and exploded into fragments as Arak was sent in a tumble. He rolled to his feet, rolling his sore shoulder as he re-evaluated the war golem. It was strong and fast. His smile broadened as he closed the distance, trying to get inside of its guard. Fists came down like thundering meteors. Arak forced to jump back into the side, slashing at the thick arms with his spear. More clotted, black blood dripped out of it faster with each slash, but it didn't slow. It was forcing him back, each attack forcing him to retreat. Frustration grew in his chest at the momentum shift. He was on the back foot, pushed to nearly his maximum just to stay ahead of White Fists. Arak watched, and watched, fighting back his impatience. His mind stirred in thought and finally he saw it. The pattern. Chapter 23. It wasn't a living, thinking thing. A war golem shaped of flesh, muscles and sinews straining tightly over the top of a metal frame and powered by infernal means. It was strong and brutal and knew not pain or fear. His every blow did not but cause more blood to flow over the stone ground, and it continued to swing its mighty arms about like a drunkard. A drunkard who fought in a simplistic pattern. Arak was a trained and thinking thing, and he figured out the rudimentary attack pattern in only a few cycles. If he could do anything about it was another matter entirely. He gritted his teeth as he dove into the windmilling arms. He ducked under a swiping arm and jumped to the left to avoid a downward swinging arm. He rushed forward and twisted right, slashing his spear along another outstretched arm. Muscles and tendons separated with an audible pop, but it didn't slow the war machine down. He was underneath the machine now, inside of its long arms, and it could do little but punch straight down and effectively. It only had the 2 legs, both oversized and grossly misshapen, but there was a joint he could attack. Arak pitted his rare great spear against the machine. He believed that the golem was a sum greater than its part. The dead stripped of dignity and molded to simple metal joints and frame, powered by common power sources, all held together with dark magics. Arak put the entirety of his body weight behind his blow, piercing muscle and fat and clanging off the metal superstructure. He wiggled the spear tip, trying to find a seam, and then the spear plunged further in. Arak twisted, putting his back and legs into pulling the spear towards the gate and away from the soldiers. There was immediate resistance, but Arak kept pushing, tendons popping in his neck as he ground his teeth and prayed that the spear outlasted the metal spars. All resistance disappeared and Arak staggered back, nearly falling down as the front of the golem's knee exploded outward in a geyser of gore. A round orb went sailing away, hitting the stone and bouncing with a clear ping that sounded over the screams and cries of battle. The golem sagged and collapsed down, barely missing Arak as it fell forward, catching itself at the last moment with its 4 arms. It was bowed down, giant boxy head near the ground and its back only at neck height. Arak jumped up and clambered to its back, the squishy materials crushed under his weight. Pools of blood formed with every step as he staggered up its back. If he remembered correctly, there was a joint right here. Arak stepped down, feeling with the spear as he wiggled about. Something hard clinked and Arak began to cut and leverage as the big golem tried to get up with its ruined leg. Without the power core though, it seemed the leg was inoperable. Samus came running up now, Nevia and her team behind him. The prince ran and leapt in a smooth motion, long dagger appearing out of nowhere to stab an arm. He began to climb, moving up the arm with quick motions. Right there, Your Highness, Rutledge's voice came booming out over the battle. The prince began to cut, sawing away at the flesh in a shower of gore that quickly coated him. Arak redoubled his pace as the rest of the soldiers began to climb up and over, looking for ways to help with their own knives. The golem was weak now that it was grounded, its great weight and strength rendered useless under sharp knives expertly applied. Arak pried the second core out while Samus got his first. Nevia wasn't far behind with her own, and the golem began to wilt, flesh slewing off in greasy blankets. Parts of the frame became visible as Podky claimed his own orb and then Constance one. Arak looked toward the center of the massive chest and knew what he had to do. He inhaled deeply, pulling in the tainted air to fill his lungs, and then he cut. Flesh parted along the back where the spine would run and he was worming his way down. His feet twisted and turned, grinding away suddenly rotting flesh, and then he was up to his chest in the machine. He exhaled and breathed in again, filling his lungs even further as he closed his eyes and left his spear buried in the machine. He wiggled down, further into it. The darkness pressed all around him, hot liquid filled his helmet as he moved by memory. The half-constructed machine appearing in his mind as he grabbed struts and pulled his way through liquefying flesh towards where he hoped the core was. His chest burned and his face was wet. The warmth of the golem pushed through his armor, heat rising as he got closer. His fingers grasped metal and he pulled himself along. He couldn't feel for the life of him as he worked further and further in, the thick metal of the gauntlets leaving nothing for his tactile senses. Worry began as his chest burned further. Salt and iron were faint on his tongue no matter how hard he squeezed his lips together. Arak kept searching, the flesh firming to a spongy resistance that parted with more and more effort. The urge to breath was becoming all-consuming. Claustrophobia wormed in his mind as the heat was rising, blanketed in pressure all around in the pitch black. His hands touched something round and firmly latched into the machine. He tugged and pulled himself towards it. He tried to find something to brace on and finally hooked his feet around struts and began to pry, slowly increasing his strength. The thin metal bands began to bend around him, he could feel it even through the armor. Rage evaporated to panic. Hot and burning it powered him as he thought of the murdered who formed this monstrosity. Mothers and fathers and children all plastered together to form this machine of nightmares. This inefficient waste of resources. The dishonoring of their bodies to build something so pathetic and weak. Muscles trembled as he yanked harder and he felt the orb begin to shift. The heat crept higher and higher and he began to feel pain even through his suit. Something strained in his chest and shoulders and a roar of pain slipped free. Blood rushed into his opened mouth and he gagged, fighting the instincts to heave. Then the orb was free. Something broke, audible even in the golem, and the orb was against his chest. The heat faded away and then there was a rush as the flesh of the golem came apart completely. Light streamed into his eyes and Arak spewed blood and bile out as he gasped for fresh air as he dangled upside down with his feet hooked into twisted metal struts. The explosion of rotting flesh rode like a wave over the handful of defenders, blanketing them. Arak swung above them all like a metal bat, the oversized core clutched in his arms. His spear fell past him, landing in the stone and piercing it with ease to wobble as he swayed back and forth. The blood was rushing to his head as he tugged at his helm to release it and its contents to splatter on the ground. Someone should help him down, Samus said. Nevia sighed as she sheathed her sword and began to scuttle up the side of the structure, 2 soldiers behind her. The ground began to shake again, deeper and with more power. Arak twisted back to look at the still glowing tunnel and saw more of the flesh golems entering. He hoped Nevia would hurry. Chapter 24, Breach. Foy's voice boomed like a war drum across the courtyard. everyone stopping as they stared at the flesh golems slowly inching their way through the gates. Arak turned and saw heads pivoting further down the wall where a smoldering hole was spitting plumes of toxic yellow smoke. Demons threw human corpses down, their bodies striking the ground limply. Waves of their hellfire caster fire rained down on the defenders, men and women disappearing in the bursts of flames. From where he was, the breach looked small, but it would expand rapidly if nobody acted quickly. Arak, go and close the breach. We will hold the gate, Samus said as he lifted his sword up and over his head. The tip of the blade glinted in the light, flames and pale light reflected in the sword as the prince's essence boiled around him, condensing in the blade before spreading out to encompass a small area all around him. The soldiers who had the wave of essence roll over them straightened up and grew stronger. Arak could almost watch as their movement became crisp and they leapt to the prince's commands. An aura ability like his own, Arak surmised. Navia twisted a spar using her own sword as leverage, and then Arak was falling, landing in a roll to get to his feet, smooth as silk. Navia scrambled down as Arak pulled his helmet off to let all the viscera slop out of it as he breathed clean air. Even infused with smoke and death, it was sweet. That was the most disgusting thing I've ever seen, Navia said as she stood beside him. Arak shook his helmet, sending long strings of coagulated blood and guts to splatter on a rushing soldier. The man shot him a disgusted look but didn't say anything as the shaking of the ground grew more intense. Arak shoved his helmet back on and began to run, heading up and toward the squad of infernal soldiers and their suppressive fire ravaging the rear of the formation. Foy was back there, along with Rutledge and Julius. Soldiers fled from his charge, forming a path for him as Navia and the rest of her squad followed in his wake. Samus was continuing to bark orders, the pulse of his aura still blanketing the area. Having been in his presence, Arak could feel the change as he left the area. The thin layer of bravery that had coated him poorly dissolved, leaving nothing behind but his pounding heart and the desire to push himself. The wall loomed up and above him, stained gray and black with nearly 20 of the demons firing downwards without hesitation. There was a small door that led into the interior of the wall, a maintenance hall or something in a similar vein. A half-dozen soldiers stood about it, fearful as blasts of hellfire splashed about them. Arak lifted his shield and the great slab of metal scraped the sides of the wall as he rushed into the doorway and began to ascend the stairs. Sticky fire clung to his armor, the heat uncomfortable, and the sides of the walls. Something screeched and cried out in a harsh foreign tongue, and then his spear was piercing something. The screeches rose by several octaves and filled with agony. Arak shook the heavy spear, ripping it free of the infernal soldier and turning to the 3 others that had been holding the landing and filling the hall with suppressive fire. He kicked the closest one, his boot cracking ribs and smashing it into the wall opposite of them. Arak's shield bashed another, sending it flailing away as the last soldier retreated, crying out in fear. He remembered the first time he had fought these types of invaders, the cowardly curs fleeing rather than dying with honor. He flicked his wrist and the spear shot across the short distance and skewered the soldier. Arak gave the 2 injured infernal soldiers the mercy of a swift death with a boot to the skull. The interior of the wall was tight, his shoulders nearly scraping the sides while he had to keep his head bowed as he walked. Pipes and cables ran along the walls, cut and burnt and broken now. Arak, are you still alive? Navia called up to him, the stairwell still glowing with fire. Arak hit his spear against the wall in a rhythm, the spear ringing loudly. The fires will take a minute or 2 to go down, and then we'll come up. Arak shrugged. So far none of these things had given him a challenge, failing to pierce his armor or do more than survive a single exchange of blows. He walked down the maintenance halls, searching for more of the demons to fight. Fallen warriors lay in broken pieces, burned to charcoal or cut apart. A few of the invaders were mixed in every few paces, still and ghastly with warriors' blood on their weapons. Arak turned a corner and saw where the enemy's siege weapons had blackened and blown a hole open. The size of a small house and 20 feet above the ground, more and more of the infernal soldiers clambered up. A dozen heads turned to look at Arak, most with their hands filled with things that weren't weapons. They were helping each other up, stashing swirling orbs filled with black mist in piles, laying their brutal blocky casters in corners. Arak was upon them like the fox in the henhouse, a blitz of steel and fury as his aura burst out around him. Blood splashed the walls and painted them a kaleidoscope of death. Demons screamed and begged, and Arak felt his soul soar as he speared, punched, kicked and crushed the invaders. Bones shattered, organs were punctured, an essence filled the room so thickly that one could breathe it. Fear. An infernal soldier jumped out the hole and towards the ground to escape Arak. Another 3 rushed up and over the edge and died, each of them in a single blow. A strangled laugh bubbled free of his scarred neck, vibrating painfully as he paused amongst the corpses. A wide, red hand grabbed the lip of the hole. Black iron gauntlets that left the last half of the fingers free had spikes on the knuckles. A second hand grabbed him, then a face was over the edge. Long and narrow, 4 yellow eyes peering from slits in the helm, the same dark metal as the gauntlets. A sword pommel poked out from over a wide shoulder as it carefully stood tall, head scraping the top of the ceiling. It looked about carefully, observing the dead demons laying in pieces. A wide smile crossed its face, showing the long, pearlescent, needle-like teeth. Worthy. Its screech assaulted his ears as its overly long arms twisted and pulled the long sword free. Arak cocked his head as the big demon realized it couldn't use its weapon in the tight confines. Its smile faded a bit, then it looked at the hold behind Arak, leading into the armory. It lowered its head and lunged, free hand knocking Arak's spear thrust awry and slamming into Arak. The two of them staggered and tripped, Arak snarling as he grappled with the creature, but then they were falling. The floor disappeared and then the feeling of dropping overwhelmed him. Arak's eyes locked with the demons for as they smashed into the ground and began to roll, each kicking the other to get free. Arak jumped to his feet and brandished spear and shield as the demons spun like a top, blade whipping around like a scythe. Bodies fell around it like wheat around it, Imperial soldiers never having a chance to fight. Blade Dancer LVL 14 Chapter 25 The sword swung back and forth, swishing through the air as the demon built momentum. Its long arms and strong wrists kept the blade a veritable blur of gray steel as the blade formed a mirage of afterimages in front of the demon. A hint of a melody, chaotic and jarring, formed in the afterimages. Arak snorted in contempt. A waste of effort. He charged, steps short and sure as he kept his shield covering his body. The moment he entered its range the blade slashed a half-dozen times, sparks erupting off of his armor as each blow struck with the force of a meteor. Arak's knees bent and bowed, threatening to fail him as the demon's smile widened. Arak stabbed at it, a simple, straight, thrust. Power rippled through his body and the spear seemed to teleport, scraping the demon's armor in a long line as it leapt backward. A white line marred the demon's armor and it looked down to stare at where that spear would have disemboweled him if it had been just a step slower. Its 4 eyes narrowed and the smile thinned. Arak kept pushing. Never once slowing, every thrust and step a half-beat faster as he began to strike with precision. Essence pulled around him again, stirring through the center of his chest and filling the air around him. The demon's sword hit and bounced off his shield, diverted his spear, tried to contain him. Arak could not be contained. He was inexorable. Unstoppable. Relentless. Arak's smile spread across his face as his heart beat faster and faster. Each thrumming beat pounded louder until his ears were trembling with the echo of the beats. His auras spread and spread, filling the area around them as Arak felt pressure building in his chest. Aura of Bloodlust advanced. LVL 2. Potency increased. The pressure exploded out of him and he could taste the fear in the air, the hints of the madness of the fight. Arak growled in his throat as the higher-level demon backed up, its eyes pinpoints of yellow as its swings became erratic, the fluidity and song fading away. Arak continued to press until the demon's back was against the wall. It tried to regain its momentum, lunging forward and slashing twice, but Arak weathered its storm, stomping on its instep. Bones crunched and the demon screamed. Arak punched it with his shield, the edge crumpling metal and shattering bone. Above him, the lesser demons were backing away from the breach as Imperial soldiers screamed and raged, racing up the stairs to fight the larger demons in a frenzy of rage. The war cries echoed out from the breach, mingling with the demons' cries as the warriors of the Empire threw them from the defenses. Arak slammed the blade dancer against the wall, stabbing it through the thigh as it bounced off the stone. He headbutted it as it bent at the waist, then hit it again with the shield's edge. The spear pinned it to the ground and Arak left it, grabbing its wrist with his now free hand. He squeezed and felt bones pop and then break, the demon releasing its sword to clatter to the stone. He headbutted it again and the creature went limp. Arak finished it quickly as it lay against the wall dazed and confused. His spear popped free and he looked at the sword laying there on the ground. Adept Sword of Discord. Uncommon. He'd come back for that later. The interior of the wall was a massive chaos as soldiers and demons fought without mercy. He watched a human scale a downed demon, crushing its skull with the butt of her caster. He saw another human disembowel down demon claws, the man still stabbing the creature with his knife over and over even as his entrails spilled out. Madness gripped this section of the armory, madness and fear. The demons were breaking. The legions of hell were filled with fear and Arak basked in it. He shed blood as he killed a pair of infernal soldiers, then spun and kicked an infernal commander out through the breach and to the hard ground below. More fighting. More dead. Demons and men, all piling up in the dark, hot passageway. The stench of blood and burnt meat mingling thick enough to choke him on. Arak kept killing, ignoring the alert, as he sent another corpse to the ground. Then there were no more demons, horns blew in the distance, brass and bellowing, and the stream finally stopped. The demons fled. All of them running, their backs to Arak as the scattered remnants retreated back to their encirclement. The ring of crushed rubble and siege weapons that the demons had built around looked flimsy and weak. The protruding cannons that aimed at the armory looked scarce and non-threatening as they urged to leap from the hall and chase after them. Arak! Navia screamed, her voice piercing through the urges to chase them down. Arak's feet were on the edge, teetering to jump down and chase those who fled. To continue the slaughter. Arak backed up, his heart beating with frantic rage at being leashed. Arak looked down at himself, drenched in blood, and then back at the demons who had fled. He lifted his spear and the remaining soldiers cheered, their minds clouded by the bloodless aura. Samus is preparing a counter-assault. He needs you down in the courtyard. They are planning on breaking the containment and linking with Colonel Gresson. Navia had to lean in to scream at him from inches away. Arak turned away and marched down the steps and toward Samus. He had mistaken the young prince, thinking him nothing more than a fop. There was a true ring of steel to the man if he was planning to assault that ring of guns and demons. Arak looked down at the broken blade singer and roughly pulled the scabbard off its back before sheathing his new sword on his hip. The long blade sat awkwardly, but he had been needing a secondary weapon. He needed a good knife or three now. Level earned. Bloodsworn LVL. 10. That was nearly as rewarding to him as the fight had been. The sword demon had been a decent challenge, but the reward looking back at him made it even better. There was a definite addiction to this, acquiring strength and power from fighting his foes. It was an intoxicating drug, one that he was going to use with great frequency as he made his way towards the Queen. But first, he had an army to break. Chapter 26. Samus and Foy were beside the broken gates, the interior hallway broken and shattered from the battle, gaping open like a sore on the wall. A pair of tanks sat there, massive and broad, the red light of fires reflecting off their silver carapaces. A thick tube emerged from the center of the squat vehicles, brutal and utilitarian. Soldiers were clustering up behind the vehicles, armed with casters and blades. Arak! Good work on sealing that breach. Many of those monstrosities came upon us, but we stood firm and battled them like real warriors. With artillery. The prince's words rang out across the grounds as Arak came to stand next to him. Prince Samus is correct. We destroyed over a dozen of their war machines and were able to salvage 6 of the prime cores. Enough for these 2 tanks. We are breaking the encirclement and making toward Colonel Gresson. Your assistance would be appreciated. Arak nodded and flashed a signal that he needed a moment. He sat down to the side and brought up the screen again and looked at what it had revealed to him. Hitting level 10 had brought enough words that it had made his head swim, but he had found what he needed to in the mountains of text. Level 10 title earned. Invincible. Your foes have struck you, clawed you, bit you, and shot you, yet you remain. For 1 second of every day you can become invincible. Skill available, 1. Spear Strike. Shield Bash. Aura of Inevitability. Aura of Immutability. Arak had to look at that for a moment. The difference in the aura abilities had changed since the last time he hit options. In the same vein but more refined. The events of the past few hours stopped him from making the easy pick. That feeling of being overwhelmed by the bloodlust, of wanting to continue the fight past the point of it being smart. Of the desire to keep spilling blood overwhelming his oaths. Spear Strike. Essence Empowered Strike. Cost, 1 essence. Arak took it. He had felt it in the last fight, with the Sword Dancer. The demon had been doing something with his sword, something that had threatened to tip the scale. He needed that same edge. Spear Strike acquired. Advisement, improve Essence Core. Advisement, improve Essence Potency. Advisement, improve Essence Channeling. Arak sank a single point into each of the stats, bringing every one of the stats up to 2. He closed the menus and then waited for the euphoria to hit, wondering what the essence growth would feel like. Pain. Intense and overwhelming. A fire that burned in his chest. Blood turning to acid. The breath was stolen from him as his vision widened out. The center of his chest tightened, compressing in a weight like a cannonball, then bursting out. Stretching his bones and skin, he felt like he was about to pop. Then it was gone and the loss made him a hollow pit. Arak staggered 2 steps forward. His vision darkened and he could make out shapes. Soldiers staring at him and he realized he had screamed. The strangled sound of his tortured vocal cords no more than a harsh, wheezing gasp. Arak? Samus said, concern spreading across his fair face as he lunged for him. Nevia beat him, her small form wedging under his shoulder and offering him enough stability so he could continue standing. Julius and Rutledge appeared like vultures, while Foy simply turned back to organizing the attack force. What happened? Julius asked. The others were simply quiet, looking at him with concern. Essence. Bigger. Arak signed awkwardly with one hand while using the other to hold on to Nevia. Ah. Interesting. Rutledge's eyes unfocused as she stared at him and Arak looked at her, realizing she had reached the 5th level of being an Imperial Sage. What's interesting, Professor? Samus asked. I can see truths. Or at least pieces of them. It's an interesting ability that I find to be very distracting. And illuminating. How vague. It seems time has not changed you at all, Professor, Samus said with a hint of a smile. Rutledge didn't acknowledge him. Arak, I would advise you not to continue on growing your essence at the moment. It seems that there are some obstacles with that route. How frustrating. The last part was no more than a whisper of her own irritation. Arak felt his strength return slowly. He had never felt this weak before. Limbs were rubbery, flopping about as he was held up only by Nevia's strength. Each pulsing heartbeat filled him with more and more strength, limbs becoming strong and firm. He stood straight and grabbed his spear and walked slowly to where the assault force was gathering. 600 men. They are all fresh and have fully charged casters. 4 shots before they have to use their own. Every spare piece of personal armor we can find, knives, axes, and single-use munitions. This is the last of what we have, Lord Bloodsworn. If this fails, the armory will fall and Colonel Gresson will be overrun. Foy was staring straight ahead through the widened-out gates. Arak nodded and grabbed a piece of protruding armor on the tank and hoisted himself up so he stood above everyone else. Eyes turned to look at him, thousands of eyes, most who had been concerned moments ago. He raised his spear above his head and shook his fist, spear wagging in the air. There was a silence for a horrible moment, and then a roar. It shook the earth and men and women streamed forward as the tanks lurched forward in silence. Nevia ran behind the lead tank, her squad tucked close to her as Prince Samus leapt onto the back of the second tank. Rutledge's sharp eyes never broke away from him, peering out from under her withered brow as Iraq passed under the melted stone gates and into the smoky haze of the chaos outside. Iraq's eyes watered instantly, the harsh sting of smoke burning through the slit of his visor. The world had changed in the last few hours, the thin ring of buildings broken down to nothing more than piles of rubble. Corpses decorated the ground, covering the hillside and down to the demons' fortifications. There was a whirring in the tank's turret, the long barrel depressing to aim down at the thickest knot of siege weapons. From here Iraq could see the wild scramble of demons, grabbing their human sacrifices and hurrying them to the bleeding tables. The cannon fired, air distorting from the heat as a meter-thick bolt of pure energy raced down the hillside and struck the center of the fortifications. Rubble exploded, blown apart in a wave, bodies thrown in ragdoll heaps out across the field. A second lance of energy flashed overhead as Iraq's tank raced forward, gathering steam as Iraq held on for dear life with one hand. He lifted his shield, to protect himself as stray bursts of demon-caster fire splashed around him. More explosions rippled out as the cannons on the top of the armory fired. The entire knot of defenses dissolved in a wave of fire and smoke. Then they were plunging into the thickest of the smoke, blinding him in a black haze. Chapter 27. A pug-ugly man stuck his head out of the tank's hatch, a halo of chestnut brown hair cut tight to his scalp. The center of his head was sunburned and flaking, dead skin pulling back from his bright red scalp. A 5 o'clock shadow darkened his jowls, black rings beneath his bloodshot blue eyes as he met Iraq's gaze. "Fucking giant's ass, you're huge. I can't see shit through this new fucking port. I'm going to ride up top and you're going to keep me alive with that huge fucking shield." The man spun and wedged a black boot against the hatch's edge and pulled a caster from the interior of the tank. The man looked around again as they broke free of the smoke screen. "Name's Dell. Now, get off your ass and cover me." The irreverent tanker scanned the ruins of the city, demons running and screaming about, bolts of hellflame splashing harmlessly off the silvery hide of the tank. Iraq shrugged and rose up higher, tanking his position next to the tanker and lifting his shield to protect him from the knot of demons in the half-destroyed row of houses to their left. Connie. Left 7 degrees. Second story. Dell's roar was a bass rumble that rolled over the sounds of the battle with ease. The tank stopped with a sudden lurch and the cannon twisted, tilting to the side and aiming at the houses that Iraq had seen movement in. Another flash as the cannon spit fire and the second story of the building disappeared. The thunder crack of the blast of displaced air rolled over him like a wave. Iraq smiled as pieces of demon rained down on them. Iraq raised his shield over his and Dell's head. "I fucking love this damn thing. Oh fuck me, those fat, ugly bastards." Dell pointed out a half-dozen flesh golems lumbering forward. Iraq watched as the second tank fired and one of the golems was dispersed across the street in pieces. Their tank fired and a pair of the golems lost their legs. Waves of singular caster fire washed over the remnants of them like a wave and they fell onto the barrage. Iraq had never participated in a battle of this scale and he could not help but revel in the size of it, the scale. Those golems were powerful creations, used to be hammers to crush the defenses. Now nothing more than scraps of meat and twisted metal. Send someone to go get those cores. We're burning through ours too fast. Iraq turned back and looked at Nevia, meeting her eyes as he lifted his spear to the pile of carnage. "Constance. You and your squad get those cores. Everyone else, lay down covering fire." Nevia's voice was a bullhorn in the chaos. Constance nodded and waved her 4 soldiers with her, all of them staying low to the ground as they raced toward where the golems had been destroyed. "Knock when you've got them," Dell said, slithering back down into the tank and closing the hatch behind him. Iraq looked around and saw the surge of demons that Dell had spotted before ducking back in the tank. Iraq landed heavily, stone cracking under his feet as he lifted his spear and shield. The leading infernal soldier hesitated, urine yellow eyes widening with fear as it hefted its own spear and looked about. Iraq leapt upon it, his boots trampling it into the ground as he struck the demon behind it. He felt the demons squirming and crying underneath him, and a knife scraped across his shin, grating on the metal in a shower of sparks. Arak killed a second demon as it ran toward him, spear punching through its chest and lifting the creature up and off the ground. Arak shook it like a terrier did a rat and then threw the creature down to splatter in front of the rest of the squad of demons. He jumped and landed in the middle of them, his spear flashed and his spear crushed the foot soldiers' chaff around him. Bolts of caster fire singed by and more of the demons died. Imperials ran forward, their weight blunting the demons' attack. Arak spied a foe rushing forward, a large shape stirring the black clouds of smoke. Flickering fires cast strange glows off its pale armor as a golden axe shone through the gloom. Fallen Empyrean Axeman LVL 16. It had the face of a man, golden-hued skin traced with black lines of pulsing corruption. Red sores wet pus and blood as crazed, bloodshot silver eyes tracked Arak. Armor was tarnished white, pitted and scarred, and the 7-foot-tall warrior carried a double-headed axe that glowed with an intensity that threatened to blind those around it. Caster fire hit its armor and bounced away, denting and scorching bits of it, adding to its disarray. It opened its mouth and rotting brown teeth showed as it cried out in a clarion call. Arak charged it before it could hit the thin line of the Imperial vanguard. The Empyrean saw him and smiled, the axe flashed and 6 men were bisected in a haze of light. Arak snarled in rage and crashed into the creature, the sound of the armor hitting a dull gong. Arak stabbed and twisted, wedging a hand into the Empyrean's tangled white hair, wrapping it around his fist as he tugged it into a building. They crashed through a partially broken down wall, rolling and spitting, both weapons lost as they punched and kicked. Arak kept his shield, as it was strapped to his arm, and he rained blows down on the axe fighter. The Empyrean wedged a foot between them and then Arak was sailing across the room, splintering the table as he landed heavily. The air whooshed out of his chest and Arak groaned as he got back up and looked at his opponent. The Empyrean lifted its hand up and the axe materialized in a flash of golden splendor. The rotten brown teeth peered out again at Arak as it began to laugh, a clear sound like the ringing of a bell. Arak rolled his neck and marched toward it, fearing not the blade that flashed at him. His heavy shield rose and met the blade, and for the first time Arak was driven back, the strength in the blow staggering him as the Empyrean grinned and continued to throw blows like a crazed man. Arak's armor held up, but he was being tossed about like a rag doll. He gritted his teeth and ducked, letting the axe sing by him and rising with a powerful uppercut that cracked into spoiled brown teeth. The crunch of bone was satisfying, the Empyrean tripping backward and spinning around to regain its balance, axe slashing the air behind it in an attempt to ward Arak back. Arak wasn't following up his attack. He had found the spear amongst the detritus and picked it up. The familiar heft of it was already a welcome change, and Arak met the creature's eyes once again. It spat broken teeth out, mixed with red-black blood. Arak smiled wider and felt the instinctive use of his new skill. Arak lunged, activating spear strike. Tope continued,